probably 2 more lectures, which is good because that'll mean that the final exam has less material on it, which I don't think anyone will complain about. Okay. Sorry about that. I should have checked that. Okay. So we're going to talk about, we talked about early Neolithic sites in, I don't remember where we were. We were about there, I think. Okay, so we talked about early Neolithic sites in Africa, and we're talking about the agricultural sites now. So just to summarize this, if I can, there are 3 major plants that were domesticated in the Sahel region of Africa. There's sorghum, which is a millet. There's another species of millet, basically an African millet that was domesticated there. And then there's Guinea rice. The one plant that's not a big food plant that is important that was domesticated in Africa is coffee. That was domesticated in Ethiopia as well. The best evidence we have for some of these plants being domesticated is actually impressions on ceramics. There's a site in West Africa known as Tar Tchit that has sorghum impressions dated only to about 1000 BC. We think that domestication occurred much earlier in this, and in fact, recent evidence from eastern Sudan in a ceramic group known as the Butana group has impressions on their ceramics dating between 3500 and 3000 BC, and it may go back further than that. We don't fully know. For a lot of reasons, there's not a lot of research that's been done in this part of Africa. There's just not a lot of people working there. This project that Frank Winchell reported on in 2017 was actually done in the early 1980s, and it just took a hell of a long time for them to go through and start looking at the impressions on the ceramics. Right now, these are not areas that are easily accessed for a whole series of different reasons. There was just a coup in Sudan. There's a lot of fighting in the rest of northern Africa going on. Can't really move around very easily without archaeologists can't without setting themselves up for getting kidnapped. And there have been a couple of French archaeologists kidnapped and held for ransom for long periods of time. So it's a dicey period. So we have some evidence here to suggest that we might have sorghum domesticated as early as 6000 BC. That's 8,000 years ago. But the only really firm evidence is in the 3,500 to 2,000 year range. But it could quite easily go back well before that. And that wouldn't be surprising. When we start to look at the cattle, we'll see the same kind of thing. This is just a summary of the radiocarbon dates from those time periods, and you can see they're all older than 3000 BC for the most part. If we look at the impressions on the ceramics, we can see that they're impressions of these kinds of seeds. These are microscopic photographs of these seeds, and they can identify with an amazing amount of accuracy what kinds of species they are. And so this is a significant study, and it's likely as more work, if it's ever done, when it's done, we'll see evidence going further back in time. The other thing that's important here is looking at one of the things that happens in some of these earlier Neolithic sites is we see that they shift over from producing stone tools to making iron tools. And there's an enormous amount of iron production that's done in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's still being done today. They still are making iron in local forges and producing their own iron. They're mining the iron minerals and making their own iron tools. And this is something that's spread quite a bit. Jerry, when this happens, the local archaeological sequence becomes known as the Iron Age, and it's earlier in West Africa, North Central Africa than anywhere else, and it's also these productions are linked, at least in the southeast part of this region, with a certain language group known as Bantu languages. And what we see is that these groups begin to spread out, and they have a very distinctive way of producing or making their villages, their architecture distinctive. And they have these enclosures, they're cooking enclosures, and then the huts are in the middle, and then the corral and storage structures here as well. And these are distinctly different than what we've seen earlier in other kinds of areas. So it's actually remarkably easy to track these guys through Africa, and you can see that there's a kind of a core area here in northern Congo and Cameroon area, and then they spread out. And these are basically the different language families, the major language families that are associated with this movement. The Khoisan language family; those are the original Bushmen and Hottentot, or Khoisan herders and hunters and gatherers. And then you have in northern Africa, you have a whole series of other different languages. But you have this group here, and the Bantu languages spread out from this, and then Western Africa, there's a whole series of other kinds of languages that spread out. And tracking these languages and tracking the spread of this archaeology is relatively easy because they're so distinctive archaeologically. Again, when you look at the language families, there's lots and lots of different languages. I can't remember, I worked in Zambia one summer, and in Zambia, which is this country here, north of Zimbabwe, there are 26 formal languages, legal languages within Zambia, including English. And a lot of those people can speak 5, 10, 15. I had a worked with a guy that could speak all 26, including English. And the diversity of language is really quite remarkable in Africa, and you can see that not only in the Bantu groups here, but in the West African groups as well. One of the things that we can also look at is we can look at haplogroups and the genetics and the DNA, and you can see, I'm not going to get into the details here, but you can see that there's an overlap between the genetics and the language families, and you can see the interaction between these people and other non-West African Bantu-speaking peoples throughout Southern Africa. One of the parts of this story that's been worked out in great detail is what's known as the Bantu expansion into sub-Saharan Africa, and we can trace that back to a core here that dates back to about 5,000 BC, mainly in the northern Congo and Cameroon area, and then through time, because as they move into the south, they're replacing herders and hunters and gatherers who are still living in rock shelters and sometimes in open sites, but a very different kind of architectural style. Ceramics, etc., go into this as well. And what you can see is they begin to spread out. It takes a long time for them to make it into East Africa. It takes a long time for them to come around the southern side of the Congo Basin. The core of the Congo Basin is not occupied until more recently because it's dense rainforest, and it's really difficult for people to make a living in those areas. It's not an easy area to settle, where the surrounding kind of halo around the Congo Basin is more open grasslands and woodlands. You go further east and you get into drier conditions here, and south as well. But you see that it takes a long time for them to spread down there, almost a little bit over 4,000 years for that to happen. They then move into East Africa, and again, we can trace that very well, about AD 100 to 200 years ago. Then they expand into this area. There's generally considered to be an eastern and a southern Bantu stream that exists. They then come down the east side of southern Africa fairly late, as late as 400 BC, and then they pretty much stop here at about an AD 500. This area over here is still occupied at this time by San or Bushmen, hunters and gatherers, and down in these areas down the coast by Khoisan or Khoi herders, and they're there when the Europeans come in. The Europeans settle the southern tip of North Africa has been settled for a long time, but the southern tip of South Africa is settled in 1652 in Cape Town in this area right here, and they're very limited settlements at that point in time. So this kind of is a summary of the Bantu expansion. So you have groups moving north of the Congo Basin into East Africa, and then spread down south of that. And then there's a western stream as well that come in, and they make it into Namibia, northern Botswana, and pretty much get stopped at that point. Let me go back to that. If we look at the core groups that are here in southern Africa, these are sort of the frontline groups, and these are groups that become known as the Xhosa and the Zulus, or the Ngunis. You can see by looking at the genetics of those folks that there's a lot of interaction with the Khoisan peoples, with the hunters and gatherers and the herders, and they incorporate those people into their tribal entities, and they are genetically very distinct, and so you can see that the mixing and the marriages and stuff that occurs there, and it still occurs today. And so we had, as recently as the 1800s, you had San groups, Bushman groups living in Lesotho. That's what this little island nation is here, surrounded by South Africa, and there are historic records of them moving into and becoming part of the groups that became known as the Basutus. And anyway, it's an interesting history there. Okay, let me go over and look at let's look at the at the herding part of this, and I want to reshare the screen. And we're going to let's see if I can expand this out. Yeah. So if we look at the herding here, the topography. It's not that topography didn't make a difference with the plants, but it's not as restrictive as the movement of herding. And there's some important things to look at here that play into this pattern. One is the distribution of mountain ranges, and these. So you have the Atlas Mountains here in north western Africa, in Morocco and Algeria especially. And then you have these highlands that go across the Sahara, kind of catty corner across the Sahara, leading into East Africa. And then this whole area is a massive ancient plateau that was formed, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. And then West Africa is fairly low with some high areas, but not many. And then there's highlands in Cameroon and northern Congo here, and then these highlands here. So this is the middle of Sahara Desert, and it's the Sahara Desert more so for the animals than for the plants. Really is a barrier for migrations and movements. This is just kind of summarizing the environment here. Here's the Sahara here. You can see the rainforests, but the rainforests are all low, and they're hard to settle. They really are hard to settle. The major river valleys, again, you can see the Congo River here. This is an area that's settled very late in time, but it's not easily settled. But the Nile Valley, the Nile River is another major area for movement up and down of people here. Sorry, I thought I looked at this. So if we look at the animals that are domesticated, one of the important animals are cattle. These are modern Watusi cattle, and they are developed we now know. We initially thought that they were developed from cattle that were brought in from India. We now know that they're actually Bos taurus, which is the Western Asian European breed. Okay, they've just been selected for these enormous horns, and their horns are huge. But we also have what are known as Afrikaner cattle. These are the breeds that were bred in the far southwest corner of Africa by the Khoikhoi or the Hottentots, and they're called Afrikaner. Afrikaner, y'all probably don't know this, but Afrikaner is the term for the Dutch, the descendants of the Dutch settlers, and so these are Afrikaners are Europeans. Okay, they're absolutely Europeans, and they obtained cattle from the Khoikhoi and began to breed them. And these can be quite enormous cattle. This bull here is easily the size of a large Brahma bull, easily 2,000 pounds, and these cattle are very well adapted to an African landscape and conditions in Africa, which is basically dry conditions with lots of diseases. If we look at one of the real sources of evidence for domestication in Africa is the rock art. And so if you go into the Sahara desert and look at the rock shelters there, there's lots and lots of rock art that show domesticated cattle. They're all over the place, and you can see different peoples herding them. You can see basically cattle raiding scenes. There's a lot of complex events going on here, so you can see conflicts and warfare and this kind of thing. The earliest evidence for cattle is argued to occur in southwest Egypt at a place called Nabta Playa and Bir Kasiba. Now, we've already heard about Nabta Playa from early evidence, fossil evidence of sorghum. Bir Kasiba is even further out in the desert and more harsh. This is a photograph of Fred Wendorf out near Nabta Playa. I actually studied under him. He was a professor at SMU. And here, what they found, and this was almost 40 years ago. They found evidence of domesticated cattle in the western desert in Egypt. And this is an area today, when you look at it, is not an area that wild cattle would have lived in. Period. It's extraordinarily dry today. There's absolutely nothing to eat. When Wendorf would take his expeditions out there, they would go out there in this train of vehicles and take everything with them that they needed: water, food, everything. They would take live animals out there and have food that they could feed them. There's no way you can survive out there. There's nobody that lives out there today. But in the past, it was a little bit better. But even at the time when Wendorf was able to find these cattle remains and date them, this still was a super dry area and too dry for cattle. And so his argument is that someone had taken herds of cattle out into the western desert in areas that the cattle could not survive naturally and had to have had some sort of human intervention to survive. And probably what we're talking about there, they were digging wells, so they were digging water holes. There may have been enough forage for them to live on. I couldn't have changed that, but there wasn't enough water. And so the argument is that the cattle came out with the people when they were occupying these areas. Now, what we're looking at here is these highland areas. This is where Bir Kasiba is and Nabta Playa. They look kind of close to the Nile River, but they're not. They're a long, long way away. Here's a scale down here in kilometers. There's about 100 or 200 kilometers between Bir Kasiba, especially, and the Nile. And you can see that these sites are just way the hell out there. These are the highlands. These are some of the early sites where we have early cattle as well. Here at Adrabos and Tentora, these other sites here. And so it looks like, and these sites are all in these highland areas. Bir Kasiba is not. These would have been better watered. And we know that, and we know that they had a different environment than they do today. Um, but you can see in this map, this is kind of a summary map, that we have these early dates for cattle in Birkasiba and Nabta Playa. They're a little bit later in the middle of Sahara and in North Africa, and even later in the Sahel, later yet in East Africa and in Cape Yabuto, and then much later, 2000 BP, here done in Southern Africa. So it takes perhaps as much as 7,700 years for cattle to be introduced into Africa and to make it all the way down south. It is a slow, torturous process, and you can see that in the whole Congo Basin, there's no early evidence for cattle at all, and they couldn't survive there. They could not survive there. If we look at the climatic record, and this is just a summary of the climatic record in the Sahara, we go through humid periods, about 20,000 BC. It's wet, and there are people out there. You then go through a hyper-arid phase here. This is 13 to 12,000, and the Sahara was virtually abandoned except for the highland areas. The rains come back, and you have a wet period here, and it's still dry, and there's reoccupation. This is early Holocene, another major drought. This is when Fred's occupation would have been here at about 9,000. A major drought here, then it gets wet again, then dry again, and it's been dry ever since. And this gives you an idea of what it's like today and how arid it is today. So these arid periods would have been really, really harsh, worse than we see today. And the wet periods are quite a bit wetter than we see today. If we want to get an idea of how these environments would have changed, then we look at historic records, we look at the rock art, we look at the fossil record, the paleontological record, and this is the evidence we have for African elephants. This is the natural range of African elephants, basically in the historic period. Today, it's much more reduced to that because of killing and poaching and stuff. But if you look in the Sahara Desert, you can look at where the evidence for rock art, where paintings are. There's not a question about whether these animals can be identified or not. And there's evidence of elephants all over the Sahara Desert. If we look at where the fossils occur, there's also a lot of fossil evidence for elephants over here. And these are modern elephants. These are not ancient fossil species here. And the historic records are more limited, but there are one or two, I thought, I don't see them here, but there's one there. There's one or two historic records of them being out. But there's a lot of evidence for the African elephants being there. We look at these are a specific kinds of fish, and again you can see where the modern range is here, and it lives in these rivers, and then over here in East Africa, northern East Africa. If you look at the rock art, there's a few sites where they are depicted in the rock art. You look at where the fossils are found in archaeological sites, much more widespread, but still kind of limited to the highland areas without any question. And then there are some modern refuges where these fish still live in some of these highland areas. And this highland area here, which is the Hogarth, has in the streams that exist there today, still has in here as well, still has species of fish living there in these streams. It's not totally all dry. The Sahara is not just a sea of sand. It has these highland areas, and so it's more varied than you might give it cause to think that it is. Again, we look at the historic hippopotamus range, and you can see where that is here in the south. There's still quite a number of hippos in Africa in these rivers. You can't haven't all been filled out. We look at recent records, and we have records that their range was extended. But you look at the fossil record, and there's lots of evidence for hippo bones here, even in the Sahara. And then the rock art shows even more widespread, and there's lots of rock art here as well. And so all this evidence goes to show you that the record of the ecological record of the Sahara is more complicated than you might think. we start to look at the archaeology here, and this is the distribution of Barb Points. These are basically harpoons, and so they would be going after fish and maybe aquatic mammals, although I don't think hippos would be in that category. And you can see that the barbed points occur all over, especially, this is Lake Chad, especially around Lake Chad, but in these other areas too. And so it shows that these people were going out there exploiting a wide range of animals, and the diversity of animals that would have been there at different times is quite different than we see today. During the Neolithic period, and this is in the Akaras Mountains in Libya, which is in southwest Libya. The rock art shows very clearly painted cattle here with these spotted cattle, as they were called in North America, and they're clearly bringing cattle out into these areas. So they're going from one area to another area, almost in a transhumance kind of pattern, probably going up to the high points in the summer and the lower points in the winter in the Highlands and the Sahara. They're still dry as hell out there, but nothing like it is today. This is just a shot of it showing some of the stable isotope evidence here for them exploiting cattle for sure. The rock shelters, again, are very well stratified with hearths in them, and you can see there's a nice sequence there. If we look at the archaeology, there's clay impressions here of some sort of grain probably being grown. There's ceramics here. Here's the Barb Points that they're making. They're making basketry and other things, and they're domestic animal bones, some of which have been turned into necklaces and this kind of thing, and bone points and stuff. So you're seeing a very diverse pattern of exploitation in an area today that is extraordinarily dry. There are human remains that have been found because of the dryness of this area. Remarkable preservation. There's actually skin preserved on this individual, but these guys are being buried. They're being wrapped up, and they're in what we call a flex burial, and buried in these rock shelters. And there's quite a bit of evidence with a lot of bone tools and that kind of thing. If we look at the ceramics, the ceramics are very well made with lots of decorations. And there have been stable carbon isotope analysis and lipid analysis found on the fatty acids that are preserved in these ceramics. And from this, we can show that they were basically storing some sort of dairy fats, i.e. milk, in these containers. And so they were almost certainly milking cattle, and they were surviving on the milk. That's one of the things that domestic cattle provide you is milk as a source of protein and fats, etc. And you don't have to kill the animal to get it. You just if they're docile enough, you milk them. That's not to say you don't get kicked. How many of y'all have ever milked a cow? Anybody? Couple? Yeah. You ever been kicked? No? Okay. Well, that's nicer cattle than I did. Sometimes they'll get pissed off at you and just whack you. But anyway, these guys were definitely at about 5,200 in the height of Sahara, going after milking cattle and herding cattle. We've gone back to this. We're going to move over and look at some of these other patterns. So you have here at about 4,000 BC, they get across the Sahara. We have them here perhaps as early as 9,000, 7,500 up here, and they get across the Sahara into the Sahel region at perhaps as early as 4,000 BC or earlier. They get into East Africa, perhaps that date or a little bit later, and much later in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the reasons that it takes so long for them to come through the Sahara, are all the diseases that you have in the equatorial African region, especially in the Congo region. Now, these diseases evolved to exploit and to take advantage of the now wild bovine populations wild cattle, antelope, etc. But they were able to infect cattle and goats, caprins, and goats and sheep as well. And what we see is that they end up in these areas. They occupy these areas on the periphery of what we call sort of the Central African disease belt. But to get to southern Africa, they have to go through this. And the diseases are trypanosomonas and malignant cothrell fever. There's also hoof and mouth diseases. These things are spread by tsetse flies. We've talked about that a little bit. And it really, the death rate on cattle in these areas is extraordinarily high. And it just doesn't make sense to try and grow cattle. So it takes basically 2,000, 2,500 years for cattle to migrate and goats to migrate south from East Africa into southern Africa, and it's a very, very slow process. If we look at, let's first look at the distribution of cattle that we can see. This helps kind of understand that this is the archaeological samples where we have cattle, and the cattle in southern Africa, I might add, are both being herded by the Khoi and also by the Bantu speakers here. So you have two potential sources of cattle here. But if we look at modern cattle, what we see is that Bos indicus, which is basically the hump cattle breed that comes out of India, they're most heavily concentrated in East Africa and with secondary areas in Western Africa. And that makes perfect sense, because what's happening is you're having people come over in boats from India, and actually even from China, and start to trade along the East African coast. And with this, they're bringing cattle with them. If we look at southern Africa, these are virtually all Bos taurus breeds. These are the Eurasian breeds. They're not coming over from India. They're coming through the Sahara, over through this area, even though they've been replaced, and then coming down into sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a different kind of pattern, indeed. If we look at the rock art in southern Africa, one of the things that we can see is that you have groups. These kind of dotted patterns here were painted in yellow. These were painted in white, and then the black is shown as black. But here you have these groups of people with small bows and arrows being attacked by these guys carrying shields. In Africa, especially in southern Africa, the shields are very distinctive to language groups. Very distinctive. And here you have these shields that have these kind of indentations in the middle and these spikes sticking out. We know these are Nguni. The Nguni tribe is the tribal group from which the Zulus, which is a single clan, developed. And then we're pretty sure that these guys here are San or Bushmen, hunters and gatherers, who have stole their cattle. So this is a cattle raiding scene, and these guys are going after them. I did a rock art survey up in the mountains in Lesotho, and we had one of these cattle raiding scenes, and they were Basutoan groups that were attacking the Bushmen who had stolen their cattle. And cattle raiding for the last 2,000 years in southern Africa was an absolute distinctive pattern on the landscape. It was happening everywhere by every group, and sometimes they were stealing huge amounts of cattle. So we know that before the Bantus arrived into southern Africa, that the Khoi had come into southern Africa and spread cattle. And there's two different models. One is that you had a movement in from East Africa, and they went down the coast, and then and then back to the east where they interacted with the Bantu speaking groups. The other model is that they came out and moved in from basically northern Botswana and came down south, and then moved around. But they came down initially through the center part of the continent there. This kind of shows that in a better illustrated